Bioshock is one of these series that somehow manages to kind of stay burned in your brain long after you've stepped away from it. I can vividly picture the descent into Rapture, or facing a Big Daddy for the very first time and realising that I've made the worst mistake of my life. And what's weird is that even if you've had the biggest twist of Bioshock 1 spoiled for you, and let's be honest, kind of everyone knows what it is now, it still works. It's kind of like Darth Vader's "No, I am your father." At this point, it's not a twist anymore, but it's a cultural thing. But the impact hasn't faded. When Atlas calmly guides you through the ruins of Rapture with that soft Irish voice, and later you discover that that politeness was all just an act, that "would you kindly" was basically a verbal handcuff, and it still hits today. And that is part of the magic of Bioshock. These games were never carried by the shock value alone, they were built on atmosphere, tonality, philosophy, systems, characters, and that all sticks with you. And one thing I want you to pick up on that is that that was all said in the past tense. Because for a franchise that was once talked about in the same reverence as Half-Life, Mass Effect, or even Fallout, Bioshock has gone almost completely silent. No new game since 2013, a remastered collection in 2016, rumours, teasers, but nothing concrete. And the industry has changed so drastically that a new Bioshock game just feels like it belongs in another era. How did one of gaming's smartest, most artistic, most celebrated series in the world just evaporate? What happened to Bioshock? Bioshock isn't a series that died because it ran out of story ideas, or because the gameplay aged poorly, or because a sequel bombed drastically. In fact, the weird part is that the series never actually had a bad entry. All three games were reviewed really well, solidly well, and are still considered classics in their own right. So why did we stop getting them? Why, after Infinite, did everything stop? Why are we living in a world where every franchise gets milked to exhaustion, like Assassin's Creed, Resident Evil, Call of Duty, Far Cry, and yet Bioshock, a series that people actively want more of, has been left relatively untouched? And that's what makes the question that I pose interesting. It's not why did Bioshock fail, it's why did Bioshock stop when it was still succeeding? And to answer that, we're going to have to go backwards to where the series began and why it hit so hard. In 2007, Bioshock was released, and Rapture wasn't a location, it was the story, it was the character, it was the metaphor. A decaying underwater city built on the idea of unbelievable freedom and absolute individualism. That is cool. Rapture worked because you felt like something terrible had happened long before the games told you. Because you have splicers muttering in the dark, that eerie kind of propaganda feeling you get from all the posters that are peeling off the walls, and of course, the big daddies that are lumbering down hallways with a mournful wail-like groan. Every inch of the place has a story. Now granted, in the first Bioshock and the Bioshock series in general, the gunplay isn't perfect and the controls were occasionally clunky. But none of that mattered because the way the plasmids, the guns, the hacking, the resourceful scarcity and the level design were all intertwined made the game feel fantastic. You weren't just shooting things, you were surviving this environment. And the choices mattered. Literally. Harvest or save a little sister, hack or brute force your way through turrets, fight a big daddy now or avoid him until later. These are all small decisions, but they added up to an experience that felt personal. Now we all know the twist of Bioshock 1, so I won't bother retelling it, but it's worth saying this at least. It wasn't the twist that was impressive, it was the commentary behind it. The idea that choice in a video game is mostly an illusion. That the player character blindly follows instructions without questioning them. This was one of the first mainstream games to actually point this out. And if anything, Bioshock wasn't just a game, it was a critique on games. And it did that without actually breaking any immersion at all. Which is why I consider Bioshock to have become legendary. Not because it was perfect, it knew exactly what it was meant to be. But then, of course, success creates expectations, and expectations are how things start to crack. And a couple of years later, in 2010, we got Bioshock 2, which is a strange one. It's not bad, it's not unnecessary, but a little bit misunderstood. Unlike the first game, Bioshock 2 wasn't made by the original creators. It was developed by 2K Marin, a studio formed to support the series but not lead it. And they had a daunting task of creating a sequel to one of the most celebrated games of its time, and honestly, they didn't mess up. On paper, playing as a Big Daddy sounds like a cash grab idea, and in practice, it actually adds a whole dimension. You're slower, heavier, stronger, more vulnerable, the guns are different, the combat feels different, the plasmid synergy is deeper and smoother. It's not a massive leap forward by any stretch of the imagination, but it's not a step backwards either, and it kind of sits comfortably in the space of evolution, not revolution. And it doesn't try and out-twist Bioshock 1, and that's really smart, because doing that probably would have been series suicide. Now this is the thing, Bioshock 2 has always kind of been seen as lesser of the series, the weakest link, if you will. And that primarily comes down to two reasons. One, it's still in Rapture, and by definition, that makes the game feel more like an expansion than an actual full-on sequel. And two, it wasn't the original director's vision for the series, and I believe that fans truly felt that. But here's the truth, Bioshock 2 is better than most people give it credit for. It's tighter, more grounded, and mechanically smoother. But still, 2K clearly wanted a bigger kind of reinvention. And this brings us to one of the most dramatic shifts in gaming history. If Bioshock 1 is a gothic horror and Bioshock 2 is basically a sequel to that, Bioshock Infinite is a blockbuster film with a massive budget and a director who realises that he can actually go insane. And trust me, the moment that you boot up Bioshock Infinite, you can really tell the disparity between the two. If you remember Rapture, it was blue, dark, wet, smoky, rusty and falling apart. Whereas the setting of Bioshock Infinite, Columbia, is sunlit, it's gold, it's green, white, clean and alive. And I believe that that contrast is deliberate. Columbia hides its horrors behind brightness. Under patriotic music and floating architecture is racism, nationalism, xenophobia, religious extremism, and societal problems that look nicer on the surface but cut deeper underneath. Gameplay-wise, the game goes full action with grapple hooks, sky rails, massive shootouts, and Elizabeth throwing you ammo from across the battlefield. Oh, and of course, you can't forget the tears in reality opening mid-combat. Infinite is way faster, more fluid and chaotic, and a complete departure from the survival tone of the first two games. And some fans didn't like this shift, others adored it, but at least it was different. And of course, you can't forget the multiversal twist. There was time travel, parallel worlds, and infinite versions of characters and events. And you know what? The game foreshadows it constantly, like the Barbershop Quartet singing God Only Knows, a song that wouldn't be made for more than 50 years. It's not subtle, but it's what makes revisiting Infinite so fun. The breadcrumbs that are left everywhere, but you don't realise until you actually finish the game. Infinite was the moment that Bioshock became something bigger than a spooky underwater shooter, but it was kind of also the moment that the series became unsustainable, because behind the scenes, things were collapsing. This is the part where most people don't talk about it. The simple reason Bioshock disappeared is, well, Ken Levine, the guy behind Bioshock, was burnt out. Hard. Infinite took 5 years, multiple rewrites, scrapped systems, cut features, scrapped storylines, internal tension and budgets that kept inflating. Genuinely, the game nearly broke the studio. After Infinite, the team shut down. Not because it failed, it sold incredibly well, but because Ken Levine didn't want to run a big studio anymore. And since then, he's formed his own studio, but isn't whatsoever making a Bioshock game. And that's primarily because 2K still owns the IP. And without that creative lead, they are faced with a massive problem. They could make a Bioshock 4, but if it flops, the brand is dead. And since 2K tends to move a bit slower these days with more high-value franchises like the Borderlands franchise and of course NBA and WWE, Bioshock was quietly placed on ice. And you might be thinking that's the end of the story, but you'd actually be wrong, because technically speaking, Bioshock 4 is still in development. Technically. It's been in development for years, it's allegedly fully open world, and it's changed studios at least once. Of course, because of that, the direction has shifted multiple times, and there's no trailer, no logo, or anything. Effectively, the game is in Bioshock hell. Now, Infinite wasn't the last thing we heard of Bioshock. Of course, there has been the Bioshock Collection, which released in 2016. A remaster of all 3 games, and replaying them today is actually still really a joy. They're not hyper-realistic, but the art direction is so strong that they basically sidestep the aging point entirely. But after that remaster, we got nothing. Rumours, speculation, tiny interviews, and the hope is that spiritual successors like Ken Levine's Judas might fill the void, but the truth is, they probably won't. People don't want Bioshock-like games, they want Bioshock. It's a very specific mix of style, substance, and tone that no one else has been able to replicate, which brings us to where we are now. So, what happened to Bioshock? Well, it didn't decline, it didn't fail, it didn't get worse, it didn't burn bridges with fans, and it didn't collapse under controversy. It simply became a victim of its own ambition. The series asked big questions, made big statements, had big ideas, and those ideas required equally huge development processes, huge budgets, and a huge creative vision from a team that eventually fractured under the pressure. The tragedy of Bioshock isn't that it's dead, it's that it stopped while it was at its peak, and in some ways that's bittersweet. Now, as mentioned, Bioshock is still coming, eventually, probably, hopefully. And even if it takes 15 years to get to the next Bioshock game, Bioshock is still one of the few franchises that can afford that kind of gap, because Bioshock isn't about trends, it's not about releasing a game every single year to meet deadlines or monetary value or anything like that. It's definitely not about live service models or battle passes or microtransactions or multiplayer. It's about worlds and ideas and stories that hit harder than they have any right to. And maybe that's why it disappeared, because making Bioshock games isn't easy, but maybe that's also why it'll matter when it eventually returns. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you did enjoy, then subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.